The swimming instructor was suspended after an incident at the pool, but the millionaire saw the towel in her backpack. It had the name of the daughter he lost on a trip 24 years ago embroidered on it. The morning sun cast dancing reflections across the pristine pool at Blue Haven Country Club, turning the water into liquid diamonds. Sienna Carter adjusted her whistle and smoothed back her auburn hair, already damp from the Miami humidity. At 28, she'd been teaching swimming for over a decade, but today felt different somehow, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. Miss Sienna, Miss Sienna. Tommy Bennett's excited voice echoed across the pool deck as the 6-year-old bounded toward her, his swim goggles askew and his Spider-Man swim trunks already soaked from splashing in the shallow end. "Hey there, champ," Sienna smiled, crouching down to his eye level. "Ready for your big race today?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the same nervous energy she'd seen in dozens of kids over the years. It was her gift, really, reading the subtle signs that others missed. The way a child's breathing changed when they approached deep water, how their shoulders tensed when they thought about putting their face under the surface. "You know what?" she said, pulling a small, worn towel from her bag. The faded blue fabric was embroidered with delicate yellow letters spelling "Little Sunshine." "This is my lucky towel. It's been with me since I was little, and it's never let me down. Want to hold it for luck." Tommy's eyes widened as he clutched the soft fabric. "Really? It's really lucky. The luckiest." Sienna winked. "But the real magic isn't in the towel. It's in believing in yourself." Around the pool, other families were gathering for the monthly youth swimming competition. Designer sunglasses reflected the morning light as perfectly manicured mothers sipped iced lattes and fathers checked their Rolexes. This was Blue Haven's world. Exclusive, pristine, and unforgiving to those who didn't belong. Sienna had never quite fit in here, despite working at the club for 3 years. Her modest Honda Civic looked out of place among the Maseratis and Bentleys in the parking lot. Her simple one-piece swimsuit and practical ponytail contrasted sharply with the other instructor's trendy athletic wear and salon-perfect hair, but none of that mattered when she was in the water. "All right, Tommy, let's practice your breathing one more time," she said, guiding him to the pool's edge. "Remember what we talked about. The water is your friend, not your enemy." As Tommy slipped into the pool, Sienna noticed Lena Bennett watching from the VIP cabana, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, Sienna could see the tension in the woman's posture, the way she kept glancing at her son with something that looked less like maternal pride and more like anxiety. The competition began with the younger swimmers. Sienna cheered for each of her students but kept a special eye on Tommy. He'd come so far since his first lesson 2 months ago, when he wouldn't even put his toe in the water without tears. "Lane 4, Tommy Bennett," the announcer called. Sienna gave him an encouraging nod as he took his position. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't, halfway through his freestyle lap. Tommy suddenly stopped swimming. His form, which had been strong and confident, dissolved into panicked flailing. His head went under once, twice, and Sienna was already moving before his third desperate gasp. She dove in without hesitation, her training taking over within seconds. She had Tommy in her arms, his small body trembling against her chest as she carried him to the pool's edge. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," she whispered, her voice calm and soothing despite her racing heart. "You're safe. I've got you." Tommy clung to her, his breathing gradually slowing as she hummed a soft melody, a tune that always seemed to come to her in moments like this. Though she couldn't remember where she'd learned it, the crowd had gone silent, dozens of eyes watching as Sienna helped Tommy out of the pool. She wrapped him in the little sunshine towel and sat with him on the deck, letting him calm down at his own pace. "What happened out there, champ?" she asked gently. "I don't know," Tommy sniffled. "Everything just got fuzzy, like I was floating away." Sienna frowned. That wasn't typical panic. It sounded almost like he'd been, "What did you do to my son?" The shriek cut through the morning air like a blade. Lena Bennett stormed across the pool deck, her designer heels clicking against the wet concrete with dangerous precision. Her face was flushed with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Mrs. Bennett, Tommy is fine," Sienna said, standing slowly while keeping a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "He had a moment of panic, but a moment of panic." Lena's voice rose higher, and Sienna realized with growing dread that people were starting to record with their phones. "My son was drowning. You were supposed to be watching him." "I was watching him," Sienna replied firmly. "That's why I was able to reach him so quickly. Sometimes these things happen in the water, even with the best swimmers. The important thing is that Tommy is safe." But Lena wasn't listening. Her eyes were wild, desperate in a way that had nothing to do with her son's safety and everything to do with something else entirely. Something Sienna couldn't identify. "This is negligence," Lena continued, her voice carrying across the pool area. "Pure negligence. I'm calling my lawyer, and I'm calling the club management. You'll never work with children again." Around them, phones continued to record. Sienna could see the other club members whispering, some nodding in agreement with Lena's accusations. In this world of privilege and perfect appearances, she was an easy target. The working-class girl who'd somehow gotten above her station. "Mommy, Miss Sienna saved me," Tommy said quietly, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Club manager Richard Ashford appeared as if summoned by the scandal, his face grave and apologetic as he approached Lena. Sienna had seen this expression before, the look of a man calculating liability and public relations damage. "Mrs. Bennett, I am so sorry about this incident," he began smoothly. "Please know that Blue Haven takes the safety of our young members very seriously." "Then you'll fire her immediately," Lena demanded, pointing at Sienna like she was something distasteful. Sienna felt the world tilt slightly. "Mr. Ashford, you know my record. I've never had a single incident in 3 years. Tommy had a panic attack, something that can happen to any swimmer. I responded exactly as I was trained to do." But she could see in Ashford's eyes that it didn't matter. The customer was always right at Blue Haven, especially when the customer was married to a city councilman and had the power to make the club's life very difficult. "Miss Carter," Ashford said with false regret, "given the circumstances, I think it's best if you clear out your locker today. We'll mail your final paycheck." The words hit her like a physical blow. 3 years of building relationships with these families, of helping dozens of children overcome their fears, of proving herself in a world that had never quite accepted her. Gone in an instant. Sienna looked around at the faces watching her humiliation. Some showed sympathy, but most were carefully neutral, unwilling to risk their own standing by defending her. Only Tommy seemed upset on her behalf, tears streaming down his small face as he clutched her lucky towel. "Can I at least say goodbye to my other students?" she asked quietly. "I think it's best if you leave immediately," Ashford replied with as much dignity as she could muster. Sienna walked to the instructor's area and began gathering her things. Her hands shook as she folded her coaching certificates and packed her spare goggles. The whispers followed her like a toxic cloud. As she reached for the little sunshine towel that Tommy was still holding, she knelt down beside him one more time. "Keep it, okay?" she whispered. "Remember what I taught you about the water being your friend? Don't let today change that." Tommy nodded solemnly and hugged the towel tighter. Sienna stood and walked toward the exit, her bag slung over her shoulder and her head held high despite the burning shame in her chest. She had made it almost to the parking lot when she noticed him. Julian Walker sat alone at a corner table, a untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. He was watching her with an intensity that made her pause, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't identify. Recognition, sympathy, something deeper. For a moment, their eyes met across the chaos, and Sienna felt an odd jolt of something, familiarity. That was impossible. She'd never seen this man before in her life, but Julian Walker had seen her, more specifically. He had seen the towel she'd so carefully folded before placing it in her bag. The towel with little sunshine, embroidered in faded yellow thread. The exact same phrase he'd whispered to his daughter Hope every night before bed, 24 years ago, before she vanished from their family vacation in Santa Barbara and was never seen again. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his mind racing with possibilities he'd stopped allowing himself to consider years ago. Could it be? After all this time, all the false leads and broken hopes, as Sienna's Honda Civic pulled out of the Blue Haven parking lot, Julian Walker made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Tomorrow, he would find out everything there was to know about Sienna Carter. And if his instincts were right, if the universe had just handed him the miracle he'd stopped believing in, he would finally have his daughter back. But first, He had to be absolutely sure. Julian Walker's hands still trembled as he drove through the gates of his Coral Gables estate. The image of that embroidered towel burned into his mind like a brand. 24 years. 24 years of searching, of chasing shadows and false leads, of watching his wife Florence slowly die from grief until that terrible night when her car went off the road in what the police called an accident. But Julian knew was something else entirely. The mansion's white columns gleamed in the afternoon sun, but Julian barely noticed the beauty that had once brought him such pride. This house had been Florence's dream, their dream, a place where they would raise Hope and maybe give her a little brother or sister. Instead, it had become a mausoleum of memories and what-ifs. He parked in the circular driveway and sat for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. His phone buzzed with messages from business associates, board meetings that needed his attention, decisions that millions of dollars hung on. All of it seemed meaningless now. Mr. Walker, Maria, his housekeeper of 15 years, appeared at the front door with concern etched on her weathered face. "You're home early today. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Maria," he managed, climbing out of the car. "Could you cancel my afternoon appointments? I need to make some calls." She nodded, knowing better than to ask questions when Julian had that particular look in his eyes. The same haunted expression he'd worn for months after Hope's disappearance. And again, after Florence's funeral, Julian made his way to his study, a dark paneled room lined with books he rarely read anymore and family photos he couldn't bear to look at. But today, he forced himself to walk to the mahogany desk where a single framed photograph sat facing away from his usual chair. With trembling fingers, he turned it around. Hope Marie Walker smiled back at him from the picture, her 4-year-old face radiant with joy as she sat on his shoulders at the Santa Barbara beach. She wore a tiny yellow sundress that matched the sunshine in her blonde curls and in her small hands. She clutched a blue towel embroidered with the words, "Little Sunshine," the same towel Julian had watched Sienna Carter fold so carefully just hours ago. "God help me," he whispered, sinking into his leather chair. It can't be her." But even as he said the words, he knew. Call it father's intuition. Call it 24 years of desperate hoping. But something deep in his soul recognized what his rational mind refused to accept. The way Sienna moved through the water with that natural grace. The gentle way she'd calmed Tommy Bennett, humming that soft melody. The same tune Florence used to sing to Hope at bedtime. Julian's phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Dr. Elias Monroe's name appeared on the screen. "Julian." The psychiatrist's voice was professionally calm but tinged with concern. "You left rather abruptly today. I wanted to check in." Dr. Monroe had been Julian's therapist for 3 years now. Ever since the breakdown that had nearly cost him his business empire, the good doctor had suggested today's trip to Blue Haven as part of Julian's ongoing treatment. Exposure therapy, he'd called it. Face your trauma by engaging with situations that remind you of what you've lost. "Elias," Julian said, his voice hoarse, "I need to see you. Tonight if possible. Of course, my office, or would you prefer I come to you? Come here, and Elias. I think I found her." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Dr. Monroe had heard this before. The false alarms. The desperate hopes that led nowhere but deeper despair. "Julian, we've talked about this. The likelihood that Hope is still alive after all these years. I saw the towel, Elias, the exact same towel. How many little sunshine towels could there possibly be?" Another pause. "I'll be there in an hour." After hanging up, Julian did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his laptop and began to research. Sienna Carter. The name rolled around in his mind like a prayer. Within minutes, he had her basic information. 28 years old, no family listed except for an emergency contact named Sister Grace at St. Grace Children's Home, an orphanage. Julian's heart raced. The timeline fit perfectly. Hope had been 4 when she disappeared, which would make her 28 now, and she'd been raised in an orphanage. He dug deeper, hiring a private investigator with a single phone call. By the time Dr. Monroe arrived, Julian had a preliminary report. Sienna Carter lived at 2847 Hibiscus Lane in a modest neighborhood 20 minutes away. She worked 3 jobs to support herself and care for an elderly nun who was suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. No criminal record, excellent references, and a reputation for being almost impossibly dedicated to helping traumatized children. "You look terrible," Dr. Monroe said bluntly as Maria showed him into the study. The psychiatrist was a small man with kind eyes and an unfortunate habit of wearing bow ties, but Julian trusted him more than anyone else in his life. "Show me," Julian said without preamble, sliding a printed photograph across the desk. It was a surveillance photo from the investigator. Sienna walking out of a grocery store, that same blue towel visible in her tote bag. Dr. Monroe studied the image carefully, then looked at the family photo Julian had turned around. The resemblance is remarkable, but Julian, you have to understand that traumatic grief can make us see patterns that aren't really there. It's not just the towel, Julian insisted. It's everything. The way she moves, the way she handled that child today. She has Florence's gentleness, and something about her eyes. He trailed off, knowing how desperate he sounded. Even if, and I stress if, this young woman is somehow connected to Hope, approaching her directly could be traumatic for both of you. If she doesn't remember her early childhood, suddenly learning she's been living under a false identity could be devastating. Julian nodded slowly. Then what do you suggest? Dr. Monroe was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden where Florence had once played with Hope among the white roses. We approach this carefully, scientifically. If you're determined to pursue this, then we need to create a situation where you can observe her more closely without revealing your suspicions. How? You mentioned she was fired today. She'll be looking for work, and given her financial situation with the elderly nun, she'll need income quickly. What if you had a family member who needed swimming lessons? Someone who'd suffered aquatic trauma and needed specialized help? Julian's mind began to race. Valeria, your niece, Henry's daughter. She's 16, and she did have that incident at the lake last summer. Julian paused, remembering his younger brother's frantic phone call about Valeria's near-drowning experience. She's been afraid of water ever since. That could work, Dr. Monroe agreed cautiously. But Julian, you have to promise me you'll be careful if this isn't Hope, and the odds are it isn't. You could be setting yourself up for another devastating disappointment. And if it is her, moving too fast could destroy any chance of a real relationship. Julian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the roses that had grown wild in the years since Florence's death. 24 years, Elias. 24 years of not knowing if she was alive or dead, if she was happy or suffering, if she even remembered us at all, if there's even a chance. I understand, but we do this my way. Slow, careful, with professional supervision every step of the way. That evening, Julian made 2 phone calls. The first was to his brother Henry, asking if Valeria might benefit from private swimming lessons to help overcome her water phobia. Henry had sounded surprised but agreeable. Anything to help his daughter. The second call was more difficult. Julian sat in his study until nearly midnight, staring at the phone number his investigator had provided. Finally, he dialed. Hello. The voice was tired, stressed. Miss Carter, my name is Julian Walker. I got your number from Blue Haven. I was there today during the incident. A long pause. If you're calling to... Actually, I'm calling because I was impressed by how you handled the situation. I have a family member who could use your help. Julian heard her sharp intake of breath. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker, but I'm not currently taking on new students. After today, I understand your hesitation, but this isn't about Blue Haven or their politics. My niece had a traumatic experience in the water last year, and she needs someone with your particular skills, someone who understands how to help children heal. Another pause. What kind of trauma? She nearly drowned in a lake. She hasn't been able to go near water since her therapist recommended aquatic therapy, but she needs an instructor who specializes in trauma recovery. Julian held his breath, waiting. He could hear the conflict in her silence. Her need for work warring with her pride and recent humiliation. The compensation would be significant, he added quietly. 3 times the standard rate for private lessons. I know you have. Expenses. How do you know about my expenses? Julian cursed internally. He'd moved too fast, revealed too much. When I spoke to Blue Haven about getting your contact information, they mentioned you care for an elderly relative. I assumed there might be medical costs involved. The silence stretched so long that Julian wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, Sienna spoke. "When would you want to start?" "Tomorrow, if possible, at my home. I have a private pool, and it would be more comfortable for my niece than a public facility. I need to think about it." "Of course. But Miss Carter, don't let what happened today define you. Some people can't recognize genuine caring when they see it. That's their loss, not yours." After she hung up, Julian sat back in his chair and stared at Hope's photograph. Tomorrow, if Sienna Carter agreed, he would have her in his home. He would be able to observe her closely, look for signs, search for proof that the impossible had actually happened. But first, he had to survive the night. 2 weeks into the swimming lessons, Sienna had established a comfortable routine at the Walker estate. She arrived each Tuesday and Thursday at 3 o'clock, spent an hour working with Valeria, and tried to ignore the way Julian watched their sessions from the terrace with the intensity of a man studying a miracle. Valeria was making remarkable progress. What had started as an inability to even sit by the pool's edge had evolved into confident waiting in the shallow end. The girl's natural athleticism was returning, along with something Sienna recognized as joy, the pure pleasure of moving through water that she'd seen in countless students over the years. "I can't believe I'm actually doing this," Valeria laughed, floating on her back while Sienna provided gentle support beneath her shoulders. 2 weeks ago, I couldn't even look at the pool without having a panic attack. "You're doing the work," Sienna smiled. "I'm just here to remind you that you're safe." But safe was exactly what Sienna wasn't feeling these days. Each visit to the Walker mansion brought new moments of unsettling familiarity. The way afternoon light fell across the marble floors, the scent of jasmine from the garden at dusk, even the particular echo her footsteps made in the grand foyer. It was as if her body remembered this place, even though her mind insisted she'd never been here before. And then there were the dreams. They'd started the night after her first lesson with Valeria and had grown more vivid each week. Always the same fragments, running through gardens of white roses, a woman's voice calling her sunshine, hands lifting her high into the air while she giggled with delight. In the dreams, she was very young, maybe 3 or 4, and everything was golden and warm and safe. She'd wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks and a melody on her lips, the same tune she'd been humming unconsciously since childhood, the tune that had nearly made Julian Walker faint the first time he heard it. "Miss Carter," Valeria's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you okay? You looked like you were somewhere else for a minute." "Sorry, just thinking." Sienna helped Valeria stand in the shallow water, ready to try a few strokes toward the deep end. "Actually," Valeria said hesitantly, "could we talk for a minute first?" Out of the water, they settled on the pool's edge, feet dangling in the warm water. Julian was inside on a business call, giving them privacy for the first time in weeks. "Is everything all right?" Sienna asked, noting the troubled expression on the teenager's face. "It's about my uncle," Valeria said quietly, "and my dad. They've been acting really weird since you started coming here." Sienna frowned. She'd barely interacted with Henry Walker, Julian's younger brother, who served as the administrative manager for Walker Holdings. The few times she'd encountered him, he'd been polite, but distant, almost cold. Nothing like Julian's warm, if sometimes overwhelming, attention. Weird how? "Uncle Julian keeps asking me questions about you, what we talk about, whether you've mentioned anything about your childhood, if you've ever said anything about family." Valeria paused, choosing her words carefully. "And my dad gets this look on his face whenever your name comes up, like he's scared or something." "Scared of what?" "I don't know. But yesterday I heard them arguing in Uncle Julian's study. Dad was saying something about letting sleeping dogs lie, and Uncle Julian was practically yelling about 24 years of not knowing. They stopped talking when they saw me." Sienna felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. "Valeria, what exactly do you know about your cousin Hope?" The girl looked around nervously, as if checking to make sure they were truly alone. "More than they think I do. I found some newspaper clippings in Dad's office once when I was little, about the disappearance and the search. But there was something else. Something about a ransom note that turned out to be fake, and how the police suspected it might have been someone close to the family." "Someone close to the family." Sienna's stomach tightened. "Like who?" "They never said, but I remember overhearing Dad on the phone once, telling someone that What happened that day in Santa Barbara was an accident, and that some secrets are better left buried. Valeria's voice dropped to a whisper. Sienna, I think my dad knows more about Hope's disappearance than he's ever told anyone. Before Sienna could respond, the sound of footsteps on the terrace announced Julian's return, but his expression when he saw them sitting so close together, clearly deep in conversation, was anything but pleased. How are the lessons going, ladies? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Great, Valeria said quickly, shooting Sienna a warning look. I was just telling Miss Carter how much more confident I feel in the water. Julian's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Wonderful, Valeria, your father called. He'd like you home for dinner tonight. Something about college preparation. As Valeria gathered her things and headed inside to change, Julian settled into a chair beside the pool. For a long moment, he simply watched Sienna, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. You have questions, he said finally. I can see it in your eyes. Sienna hesitated, then decided on honesty. Mr. Walker, I feel like there's something you're not telling me about why you really hired me, about why you watch me like you're looking for something. Julian was quiet for so long that Sienna wondered if he'd even heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What would you say if I told you that I think you're someone I've been looking for my entire adult life? The words hung between them like a challenge. Sienna's heart began to race, though she couldn't have said why. I'd say that sounds like the beginning of either a very romantic story or a very scary one, she said carefully. Julian's laugh was hollow. In this case, it's neither. It's the story of a father who lost his little girl and never stopped believing she might come home. Mr. Walker. Julian, please. Julian, she corrected. I think your grief over Hope might be making you see connections that aren't really there. I understand the need to find meaning in coincidences, but show me your right shoulder. The request was so unexpected that Sienna blinked. Excuse me, your right shoulder? Is there a birthmark there, shaped like a crescent moon? Sienna's blood turned to ice. Very slowly, she pulled the strap of her swimsuit aside, revealing the small, distinctive mark that had been there since birth. It was something she'd always been self-conscious about, usually keeping it covered even in bathing suits. Julian made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. How did you know about that? Sienna whispered, suddenly feeling like the ground beneath her was shifting. Instead of answering, Julian pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos. With shaking hands, he turned the screen toward her. The image was clearly very old, probably taken with a film camera and later scanned. It showed a beautiful brunette woman sitting on a beach blanket, holding a small blonde toddler on her lap. The child was laughing, her little arms raised toward the camera, and clearly visible on her right shoulder was a crescent-shaped birthmark identical to Sienna's. This is Hope, Julian said, his voice breaking. This is my daughter. And that birthmark, Florence called it her little moon, because it reminded her of the night Hope was born during a crescent moon in August. Sienna stared at the photo, her mind reeling. The resemblance between herself and the woman in the picture was unmistakable. They could have been sisters. And the birthmark. This doesn't mean anything, she said desperately, even as her hands began to shake. Lots of people have birthmarks. The resemblance could be coincidental. I grew up in an orphanage, Mr. Walker. My parents died when I was 4. Sister Grace has been the only family I've ever known. But even as she said the words, fragments of memory were surfacing. Not the golden dreams of white roses and safety, but something darker. Flashes of confusion and fear, of strange faces and unfamiliar places, of waking up in a hospital bed with no memory of how she'd gotten there, and a kind nun telling her that her name was Sienna and that she was safe now. What was the name of the orphanage? Julian asked gently. St. Grace Children's Home, but it closed down years ago when Sister Grace retired. And you don't remember anything from before you were 4. Sienna pressed her hands to her temples, where a headache was beginning to bloom. I always assumed it was because of the trauma of losing my parents. Sister Grace said I'd been found after an accident, that I'd hit my head and had some memory loss. She said it was better if I didn't try to remember the painful parts. Julian leaned forward in his chair, hope and anguish warring in his expression. Sienna, what if what you can't remember isn't painful? What if it's beautiful? What if somewhere in your mind You still remember a daddy who loved you more than life itself, and a mommy who sang you to sleep every night. Stop. Sienna stood abruptly, backing away from him. Just stop. I know who I am. I know where I came from. I'm not your daughter, Mr. Walker. Your daughter disappeared 24 years ago. I'm just a swimming instructor with a birthmark and some childhood trauma, that's all. But as she grabbed her bag and headed for the house, Julian's voice followed her. The song you hum? He called out. It's called Dreams of Sunshine. Florence made it up when she was pregnant with Hope. She used to sing it every night at bedtime. We never taught it to anyone else, Sienna. No one else in the world knows that song. Sienna froze in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles went white, because deep in her heart, in a place she'd kept locked away since childhood, she could hear an echo of that same voice Julian had mentioned. A woman's voice, soft and loving, singing her to sleep with words she'd forgotten, but a melody that had lived in her soul for 24 years. Dreams of sunshine, dreams so bright. Mommy loves you through the night. Without another word, she fled. Sienna drove home in a daze, Julian's words echoing in her mind like a broken record. No one else in the world knows that song. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she pulled into the driveway of the small house she shared with Sister Grace. The same house that had been her refuge for over 2 decades. Inside, she found Sister Grace sitting in her favorite armchair, staring out the window with the vacant expression that had become increasingly common as the Alzheimer's progressed. But today, something was different. The elderly nun's eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. And when she saw Sienna, she smiled with genuine recognition. "Sienna, dear," Sister Grace said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "You look troubled. Come sit with me." Sienna settled on the ottoman beside the chair, taking Sister Grace's weathered hands in hers, even in her confused state. The nun had always been able to sense when something was wrong. "Sister Grace," Sienna began carefully, "I need to ask you about something, about my past." The older woman's expression grew wary. "What about your past, child? You've always told me that my parents died in an accident when I was 4, that I was found injured and brought to the orphanage with no memory of what happened." "Yes," Sister Grace said slowly, "that's what happened. But what if it wasn't?" Sienna leaned forward, studying the nun's face. "What if there's more to the story? What if my parents didn't die?" Sister Grace's hands began to shake, and for a moment, Sienna thought the clarity was fading. But then the elderly woman spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been waiting for this day for 24 years. "What do you mean?" "The day when someone would come looking, when the truth would finally surface." Sister Grace closed her eyes, as if gathering strength for what she was about to say. "Sienna, there's something I need to show you. Something I should have shown you years ago, but I was too afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what might happen if the truth came out." Sister Grace struggled to stand, leaning heavily on Sienna's arm. "In my bedroom closet, behind the Christmas decorations, there's a box. A blue box with your name on it." Sienna's heart pounded as she helped Sister Grace to her bedroom. She'd been in this closet hundreds of times over the years, but she'd never noticed anything unusual. But as she moved aside the boxes of holiday decorations, her fingers found something hidden in the very back corner, a medium-sized blue box with Hope written on the lid in faded gold letters. Not Sienna. Hope. With trembling hands, she lifted the box and carried it back to the living room. Sister Grace was crying now, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "Open it," the nun whispered. "It's time you knew who you really are." The first thing Sienna saw when she lifted the lid was a photograph, the same beach photo Julian had shown her. But this copy was clearly the original, with a small tear in one corner and writing on the back. "Hope's 3rd birthday, Santa Barbara, August 2001, our little sunshine." Below that, in different handwriting, Florence Walker and Hope Marie Walker. Hope Marie Walker, not Sienna Carter, her hands shaking. She dug deeper into the box, a birth certificate with her real name and birth date. August 15th, 1997. A hospital bracelet from Hope M. Walker, age 4. A small gold chain with a sun-shaped pendant that matched the little sunshine embroidery on her towel. And beneath everything else, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She untied the ribbon with numb fingers and opened the first letter. The handwriting was masculine, desperate. My darling Hope, today marks 1 year since you disappeared. The police have stopped actively searching, but I will never stop. I will find you, sweetheart. Daddy will always find you. I love you to the moon and back, my little sunshine. Forever yours. Daddy. The letter was dated August 15th, 2002. Hope's 5th birthday. There were dozens more. One for every birthday, every Christmas, every major holiday for 24 years. The most recent was dated just 3 months ago. My beautiful Hope, you would be 28 today. Old enough to have a family of your own. Maybe children who would have been my grandchildren. I wonder if you remember us at all. If somewhere in your heart you still carry the love your mother and I had for you. Florence died believing you were gone forever, but I can't let go. I won't let go. If there's even a chance you're out there, I'll keep searching until my last breath. Happy birthday, my little sunshine. All my love, Daddy. Sienna looked up at Sister Grace through a veil of tears. How long have you known? Since the beginning, the nun admitted, her voice heavy with guilt. A man brought you to the orphanage in the middle of the night. He said there had been an accident, that you'd hit your head and couldn't remember anything. He gave me money, more money than the orphanage had ever seen, and told me to create new records for you, to give you a new name, a new identity. What man? He said his name was Henry. He said your father was a dangerous man, that you'd never be safe if he found you. He said this was the only way to protect you. Henry, Julian's brother, the man Valeria suspected knew more about Hope's disappearance than he'd ever admitted. Did you believe him? Sienna asked. Sister Grace shook her head. Not entirely. You were terrified. Yes, but not of your father. You kept asking for your daddy and Mama Florence. It broke my heart. But the man, Henry, he said if I ever told anyone the truth, he'd make sure the orphanage was shut down and all the children would be sent to state facilities. I couldn't let that happen to the other children. So you kept quiet. For 24 years. I tried to tell you once when you turned 18, but you were so happy, so settled. You'd been accepted to college. You were thriving. I convinced myself that ignorance was kinder than the truth. Sienna stood and walked to the window, staring out at the modest neighborhood she'd called home for most of her life. Everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie. Her name, her history, her identity. All of it constructed by a man who had stolen her from her family for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. The letters, she said suddenly, turning back to Sister Grace. You've been receiving them all these years. They came to a post office box. Henry set it up when he brought you to me. He said it was important to maintain the illusion that you were still missing, in case anyone came looking. Every few months, he would collect them and bring them to me. I always meant to destroy them, but Sister Grace's voice broke. They were so full of love. Even when I was angry at the deception, I couldn't bring myself to throw away a father's love letters to his lost child. Is Henry still? Sienna began, but she was interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. Julian's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, she considered not answering. How could she face him now? Knowing what she knew, how could she look into his eyes and see 24 years of grief that she could have ended at any time if she'd just known the truth? But the phone kept ringing, insistent and urgent. Sienna. Julian's voice was strained when she finally answered. Thank God. Are you at home? Yes. Why? I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't go anywhere. Lock your doors. I'm calling the police, and then I'm coming to get you. Julian, what's wrong? It's Henry. After you left today, I confronted him about some inconsistencies in his story about Hope's disappearance. He confessed. Sienna, he confessed to everything. Sienna's blood turned to ice. What do you mean, everything? He took you, 24 years ago. He took you from our hotel room in Santa Barbara. It wasn't a stranger who kidnapped Hope. It was my own brother. The phone slipped from Sienna's nerveless fingers. Clattering to the floor, Sister Grace was watching her with growing alarm, but Sienna could barely focus on anything beyond the roaring in her ears. Sienna, Julian's voice crackled from the phone on the floor. Sienna, are you there? She picked up the phone with shaking hands. I'm here. He's gone. Henry's gone. He left work hours ago and no one knows where he is. But Sienna, before he disappeared, He accessed the security system records for your house. He knows where you live. Why would he? Because you remember now, don't you? You figured out who you really are, and Henry can't afford to let that truth come to light. Sienna looked at Sister Grace, at the box of evidence scattered across the coffee table, at the 24 years' worth of love letters from a father who had never stopped searching for his daughter. "Julian," she whispered, "I need to tell you something. I found..." The sound of a car door slamming outside cut her off. Sister Grace gripped her arm with surprising strength. "He's here," the nun whispered. "Henry's here." Through the front window, Sienna could see a dark sedan parked across the street. A figure was getting out. A man she recognized from her brief encounters at the Walker mansion. Henry Walker looked older than his 50 years, his face haggard with what might have been guilt or desperation. "Julian," Sienna said urgently into the phone. "Henry's outside my house. I need you to..." But the line went dead, and as she watched through the window, Henry Walker began walking across the street toward her front door, his hand reaching into his jacket for something she couldn't see but feared to imagine. 24 years of lies were about to come crashing down, and Sienna wasn't sure any of them would survive the collision with the truth. Santa Barbara, California, August 15th, 2001. Henry Walker stood outside the luxury hotel suite, his heart pounding with a mixture of determination and terror. Through the slightly open door, he could hear his brother Julian's voice on a business call, discussing construction permits and zoning variances, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Florence's laughter drifted from the bedroom where she was getting 4-year-old Hope ready for their afternoon at the beach. That laugh, light and musical, had haunted Henry's dreams for 3 years, ever since Julian had brought his new bride home for Christmas, and Henry had fallen hopelessly, desperately in love with his brother's wife. For 3 years, he'd watched Julian take for granted what Henry would have killed to have. The perfect wife, the perfect daughter, the perfect life. Julian, who'd always gotten everything first. Their father's approval, the business opportunities, the respect of their peers, and now Florence, the only woman Henry had ever loved with his whole soul. But today, that was going to change. Henry had spent months planning this moment. He'd studied Julian's schedule, learned the family's routines, mapped out every detail of their Santa Barbara vacation. The plan was simple. Take Hope for a few hours. Let Julian experience the terror of thinking he'd lost her, then find her and be the hero. And Florence would see what kind of protector Henry could be, would realize that Julian was careless with the things that mattered most. It wasn't supposed to be a real kidnapping, just a scare, just enough to plant seeds of doubt about Julian's fitness as a husband and father. Henry slipped into the suite while Julian was distracted on his call. The living room was empty, toys scattered across the expensive carpet. He could hear Florence in the bathroom, running water for Hope's bath. "Hope, sweetheart," he called softly. "Uncle Henry has a surprise for you." The little girl emerged from the bedroom, her blonde curls damp with humidity, and her blue eyes bright with curiosity. She was wearing a yellow sundress that made her look like a ray of sunshine. Florence's little angel, Julian's precious princess, Uncle Henry. Hope smiled, running to him with the trust that only children possessed. "Are we going to the beach now?" "Even better," Henry said, lifting her into his arms. His hands were shaking. "We're going on a special adventure, but it's a secret, okay? We can't tell Mommy and Daddy until later." Hope giggled and pressed her finger to her lips. Secret adventure. Getting out of the hotel was easier than Henry had expected. Hope chattered happily as he carried her to his rental car, telling him about the sandcastles she wanted to build and the shells she hoped to find. She trusted him completely. This innocent child who had no idea she was being used as a pawn in her uncle's twisted game. The cabin Henry had rented was 40 minutes up the coast, isolated and perfect for his purposes. He'd planned to keep Hope there for just a few hours, long enough for Julian to call the police and realize what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. Then Henry would discover her during a fake search and deliver her safely home, the hero who'd saved the day. But from the moment they arrived at the cabin, things began to go wrong. Hope, sensing something was off about this adventure, began asking for her parents. When Henry told her they would see Mommy and Daddy later, she started to cry. When he tried to distract her with snacks and games, she became inconsolable. "I want to go home," she sobbed, her small fists pounding against Henry's chest. "I want Daddy. I want Mama Florence." "Shh, Hope, it's okay." Henry tried to soothe her, but panic was setting in. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The child was supposed to be happy, safe, maybe even excited about their adventure. Instead, she was terrified, and Henry realized with growing horror that he had no idea how to comfort a frightened 4-year-old. Hours passed. Hope's crying turned to exhausted whimpers, then to an eerie quiet that worried Henry even more than the tears had. She sat curled in a corner of the cabin's small living room, clutching a throw pillow and staring at him with eyes that no longer held any trust. By evening, Henry knew he'd made a terrible mistake. Whatever romantic fantasy he'd harbored about winning Florence's love by playing the hero had crumbled in the face of Hope's genuine terror. This wasn't a game. He'd traumatized an innocent child for his own selfish purposes. He had to take her back. He had to return her to Julian and Florence and pray they would forgive him. Maybe he could claim he'd found her wandering alone, that she'd gotten lost somehow. But as Henry reached for Hope, ready to carry her back to the car, she scrambled away from him in fear, in her panic to escape his outstretched hands. She stumbled backward toward the cabin's steep wooden staircase. "Hope, no!" Henry lunged forward, but he was too late. The little girl tumbled down the stairs with a sickening series of thuds, her small body striking each wooden step before coming to rest at the bottom in a motionless heap. Henry flew down the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. Hope was unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. Oh God, what have I done?" Henry whispered, gathering the child in his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for one terrible moment, he thought she was dead, but she was breathing. Barely, but breathing. Henry drove like a madman to the nearest hospital, his mind racing with panic and desperation. He couldn't take her back to Julian now. Not like this. How would he explain her injuries? How could he admit what he'd done at the hospital? He told them he'd found the child on the beach, that she appeared to have fallen from some rocks. The doctors, focused on treating her head trauma, didn't question his story closely. Hope was alive but had suffered a significant concussion. When she finally woke up 2 days later, she remembered nothing. Not her name, not her family, not the uncle who had stolen her from her bed. The amnesia gave Henry an idea born of pure desperation. If Hope couldn't remember who she was, then maybe she didn't have to be Hope Walker anymore. Maybe she could disappear entirely, and Julian would never have to know what his brother had done. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't what Henry had planned, but it was better than admitting to kidnapping and nearly killing his own niece. While Hope recovered in the hospital, Henry created a new identity for her. He forged documents claiming she was an orphaned child named Sienna Carter, a victim of a car accident that had killed her parents and left her with memory loss. He found St. Grace Children's Home through a private investigator who specialized in discreet placements, and he paid Sister Grace more money than the struggling orphanage had seen in years. The nun was suspicious, but the promise of enough funding to keep the orphanage running for decades was too good to pass up. And Hope, now Sienna, needed care that the overwhelmed hospital system couldn't provide. Meanwhile, Henry fed false information to the Santa Barbara police. He planted evidence suggesting Hope had wandered to the beach and drowned, her body carried out to sea. He watched his brother's face crumble with grief as the search was called off. Watched Florence descend into a depression so deep she would never climb out of it. The guilt nearly killed him. Every family dinner became torture. Every holiday a reminder of what he'd destroyed. He watched Julian age 10 years in 10 months. Saw Florence fade away like a flower deprived of sunlight. When she died in that car accident 5 years later, Henry knew it was suicide, and he knew he was responsible for pushing her to that breaking point. But still, he kept the secret. He couldn't undo what he'd done, and confessing would only destroy what was left of Julian's life. Better to let his brother believe his daughter had died quickly and painlessly than to know she'd been betrayed by her own uncle. For 24 years, Henry lived with the weight of his sin. He visited the orphanage regularly, always from a distance, watching Hope, Sienna, grow into a woman. He made sure Sister Grace had everything she needed to care for the child. He intercepted every letter Julian wrote, every birthday card, every desperate plea from a father who refused to stop hoping. He told himself he was protecting everyone, Julian from the truth, Sienna from a past that might destroy her, himself from the consequences of his actions. But deep down, he knew he was just a coward who'd let his obsession with Florence destroy an entire family. And now, as he sat in his car outside Sienna's modest house, watching her through the window as she spoke urgently on the phone, Henry knew his 24 years of lies were finally coming to an end. Julian had confronted him that afternoon, armed with questions Henry couldn't answer and suspicions that were all too accurate. In a moment of crushing guilt and exhaustion, Henry had broken down and confessed everything: the obsession with Florence, the botched kidnapping, the accident that had nearly killed Hope, the decades of deception that followed. Julian's face had gone through a dozen emotions: shock, horror, rage, and finally, a cold fury that was more terrifying than screaming would have been. "Where is she?" Julian had whispered. "Where is my daughter?" And Henry had told him, after 24 years of silence, he'd given up the one secret that had kept his world from completely falling apart. Now Julian was coming for Sienna, and Henry knew exactly what that meant. His brother would take back his daughter, expose the truth, and Henry would lose everything: his freedom, his family, his life as he knew it. Unless he acted first. Henry reached into his jacket and felt the cold metal of the gun he'd been carrying for 3 days now. Ever since he'd realized Julian was getting too close to the truth, he'd originally intended to use it on himself. A final escape from the guilt that had consumed him for over 2 decades. But as he watched Sienna through the window, seeing Julian's eyes in her face and Florence's grace in her movements, Henry realized there might be another solution. If Sienna disappeared again, permanently this time, there would be no proof of what he'd done, no witness to his crimes, no daughter for Julian to reclaim. It wouldn't bring back the family he'd destroyed, but it would ensure that his secret died with him. Henry Walker took a deep breath, checked his gun one last time, and stepped out of his car. Sienna's heart hammered against her ribs as Henry's footsteps echoed on her front porch. Sister Grace gripped her arm with surprising strength, her clouded eyes suddenly sharp with fear. "The back door," the elderly nun whispered urgently. "Go out the back." But it was too late. The front door's lock clicked, and Sienna realized with growing horror that Henry had a key. Of course he did. He'd been paying for this house, managing her life from the shadows for 24 years. He probably had keys to everything. "Don't run, Sienna," Henry's voice called from the foyer, calm and reasonable in a way that made her skin crawl. "We need to talk, all of us." Sister Grace squeezed Sienna's hand and whispered, "I'm sorry, child. I'm so sorry for all of it." Henry appeared in the living room doorway, and Sienna was shocked by his appearance, the last time she'd seen him at the Walker mansion. He'd been impeccably dressed and controlled. Now he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held the desperate gleam of someone who'd finally reached the end of a very long, very dark road. "Hello, Hope," he said softly, using her real name for the first time in 24 years. "My name is Sienna," she replied automatically, though the words felt strange in her mouth now. Henry smiled sadly. "No, it isn't. It never was. Sienna Carter was a fiction I created to protect you. To protect all of us, really. Though I know that's hard to believe now." "Protect me from what?" Sienna demanded, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "From my father who loved me. From a family that never stopped looking for me. From the truth of what really happened that day in Santa Barbara." Henry moved into the room slowly, his hands visible but something about his posture suggesting he was armed. "From the knowledge that your beloved Uncle Henry destroyed your family because he couldn't control his own selfish desires." Sister Grace struggled to her feet, placing herself between Henry and Sienna despite her frail condition. "You promised," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "You promised she would be safe. You promised no one would ever hurt her again." "I kept that promise for 24 years, Henry replied. "But promises have a way of breaking, don't they, sister? Just like families. Just like little girls who fall downstairs because their uncle was too stupid and selfish to think through the consequences of his actions." The casual way he mentioned her fall. The fall, the accident that had stolen her memories and changed the course of her life, made Sienna's stomach lurch. "You were there," she whispered. "When I fell, you were there." "I was more than there," Henry said, sinking into Sister Grace's recliner with the weight of a man carrying decades of guilt. I was the reason you fell. I was the reason you were in that cabin in the first place, terrified and crying for parents who were 40 miles away thinking you were dead. And then, in the fading afternoon light of the small living room where she'd grown up, Henry Walker told Sienna the complete truth about the worst day of her life. He spoke with the mechanical precision of someone who'd rehearsed this confession in his mind 1,000 times. His obsession with Florence, the twisted plan to make Julian look like a careless father, the kidnapping that was supposed to last only hours, Hope's terror when she realized something was wrong, the accident that had nearly killed her. "I never meant for you to get hurt," Henry said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted, God, I don't even know what I wanted anymore, to be the hero, to make Florence see that Julian didn't deserve her. It was insane. All of it was insane." Sienna listened in stunned silence, pieces of her fractured childhood clicking into place like a puzzle she'd never known she was solving. The nightmares that had plagued her for years, flashes of falling, of hitting something hard, of waking up somewhere strange and frightening. They weren't just dreams. They were memories trying to surface through the trauma. "Why didn't you take me back?" she asked when Henry finished his story. "After the accident, why didn't you take me to a hospital and then back to my parents?" Henry's laugh was bitter. "Because I was a coward. Because admitting what I'd done would have meant losing everything. My family, my freedom, my life as I knew it. It was easier to let everyone believe you were dead than to face the consequences of my actions." "Easier for who?" Sienna's voice rose with anger. "Easier for you, maybe. But what about my father? What about Florence? She died thinking I was dead, didn't she?" "Yes." The single word came out as barely a whisper. 5 years after you disappeared, Florence drove her car into a tree during a rainstorm. The police called it an accident. But Julian and I both knew better. She couldn't live with the grief anymore. The weight of that revelation hit Sienna like a physical blow. Her mother, because Florence was her mother in every way that mattered, had killed herself from grief over a daughter who was alive and safe just a few hours away. "You monster," Sister Grace breathed, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You let that poor woman die thinking her baby was gone forever. You think I don't know that?" Henry's composure finally cracked, and Sienna could see the raw anguish that had been eating him alive for decades. "You think there's been a single day in 24 years when I haven't thought about Florence's face at Hope's funeral, when I haven't wondered if Sienna, Hope, would have been better off if I'd just let her stay missing. She would have been better off if you'd never taken her in the first place," Sister Grace said fiercely. "She would have been better off growing up with parents who loved her instead of hiding in an orphanage because of your guilty conscience." Henry flinched as if he'd been slapped. "I know that, God help me, I know that. But I can't undo what I did. All I could do was try to give her a good life, make sure she was safe and cared for. By lying to her, by stealing 24 years from her father." Sienna stood up, her hands shaking with rage. "By letting me grow up thinking I was alone in the world when I had a family that loved me. Your father is coming for you," Henry said quietly. "Julian figured it out. He confronted me this afternoon. And I told him everything. He knows where you are, who you are. He'll be here soon." Despite everything, Sienna felt a flutter of hope. Julian was coming. Her father, the word still felt strange but increasingly right, was coming to take her home. But Henry's next words shattered that hope. "I can't let that happen." Sienna saw the gun before Sister Grace did. Henry pulled it from his jacket with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who'd thought this through carefully. "Put that away," Sister Grace commanded with surprising authority. "Haven't you done enough damage to this family?" "That's exactly the point," Henry said sadly. "I've done too much damage. If Julian takes Hope home, if the truth comes out, it won't bring back Florence. It won't undo 24 years of pain. It will just create more victims." "What are you talking about?" Sienna asked. Though part of her already knew. "My confession to Julian, when the police investigate, they'll discover I paid you to keep quiet, Sister Grace. They'll assume you were part of the conspiracy from the beginning. You'll go to prison at 81 years old for accessory to kidnapping." Sister Grace paled but held her ground. "I'm not afraid of the consequences of my choices. And Julian," Henry continued, "will have to live with knowing his own brother stole his daughter and let his wife die from grief. It will destroy him, And Valeria? My poor Valeria will have to grow up knowing her father is a kidnapper and a coward. So what's your solution? Sienna demanded. Murder us both and run. Henry's smile was infinitely sad. Not murder, Hope, and I'm not running anywhere. I'm going to finish what I started 24 years ago. Which is what exactly? Make you disappear permanently this time and then, he gestured to the gun, join you. The police will find our bodies and assume it was a murder-suicide. A troubled man who became obsessed with the woman he was stalking. Sister Grace will be safe. Just another victim of a madman's final act. You're insane, Sienna breathed. I've been insane for 24 years, Henry agreed. This is just the first sane thing I've done in all that time. Outside, Sienna could hear the distant wail of sirens growing closer. Julian had called the police, just as he'd promised. Help was coming. But as Henry stood up and pointed the gun at her chest, Sienna realized it might not arrive in time. I really am sorry, Hope, Henry said, and she could see in his eyes that he meant it. For all of it, I hope someday you can forgive me. Wait, Sienna said desperately. Before you do this, can I ask you something? Henry paused, finger on the trigger. Did she know? Sienna asked. Florence, did she know how much you loved her? Henry's face crumpled. No, I never told her. I was too much of a coward for that. Too. Then tell her now, Sienna said softly. When you see her again, tell her you're sorry for the pain you caused, and that you spent 24 years trying to protect the daughter she loved. For a moment, Henry's resolve wavered. The gun in his hand trembled, and Sienna thought she might have reached him. But then the sirens grew louder, and Henry's face hardened with renewed determination. It's too late for apologies, he said. Some things can't be forgiven. The gun steadied in his hands, aimed directly at Sienna's heart. And in that moment, Sister Grace did something that surprised them both. She began to sing, dreams of sunshine, dreams so bright. Mommy loves you through the night. Henry froze, his finger still on the trigger, but his attention captured by the familiar melody. It was the song Florence had sung to Hope every night, the song Julian had mentioned just hours earlier. How do you know that song? Henry whispered. Sister Grace smiled through her tears. She sang it, Henry, every night for 24 years. Hope sang herself to sleep with her mother's lullaby. You couldn't steal that from her. You couldn't steal the love. And as the police sirens grew deafeningly close, and the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the street, Sienna heard her own voice join Sister Grace's in the song that had been her lifeline through decades of unconscious grief. Outside, Julian Walker was running toward the house where his daughter had been hidden for 24 years, desperate to reach her before it was too late. Inside, Hope Marie Walker was finally remembering who she was supposed to be. The front door exploded inward just as Henry's finger began to tighten on the trigger. Julian burst through the doorway like an avenging angel, followed closely by 3 Miami police officers with their weapons drawn. Drop the weapon! The lead officer's voice boomed through the small living room. Now. But Henry didn't lower the gun. Instead, he swung it toward the doorway, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who'd already decided he had nothing left to lose. Stay back, Henry shouted, his voice cracking with 24 years of suppressed guilt and terror. All of you, just stay back. This doesn't concern you. Like hell it doesn't, Julian snarled, his eyes locked on his brother's face with a fury that made the air in the room feel electric. That's my daughter. You're pointing a gun at, you son of a bitch. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sienna saw Henry's composure completely shatter. His face crumpled as if Julian's words had been a physical blow. She's not your daughter anymore, Henry said, but his voice lacked conviction. She hasn't been your daughter for 24 years. She's Sienna Carter now. She's built a life, Julian. A good life. Why can't you just let her be? Because you stole her from me. Julian took a step forward despite the police officer's attempts to hold him back. You stole my little girl. You let my wife die thinking she was dead, and you've been lying to my face for over 2 decades, and now you want to kill her rather than face the consequences of what you've done. I never meant for any of this to happen. Henry's gun wavered between Julian and Sienna, his hands shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip. I loved her, Julian. I loved Florence so much it was killing me. And you had everything. You always had everything. So you decided to destroy it. Julian's voice was deadly quiet now, more terrifying than his earlier shouting. You decided that if you couldn't have Florence, then I shouldn't have her either. Or Hope. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Henry's voice broke completely. I was going to bring her back. I was going to be the hero who found her and brought her home safe. But she got scared, and she fell. And when she woke up, she didn't remember anything. And You what, Henry? Julian demanded, taking another careful step forward. You decided it was easier to let us grieve for the rest of our lives. You decided our pain was worth less than your convenience. Sister Grace, who had been watching this confrontation with growing alarm, suddenly stepped between the brothers. Enough, she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing crises. Both of you. Enough, Henry. You're not solving anything with that gun. And Julian, antagonizing him isn't helping anyone. Sister Grace, get away from him, one of the police officers called out. Sir, we need you to put down the weapon and step away from the civilians. But Henry wasn't listening to the police. His attention was fixed on Sister Grace, and something in his expression had shifted from desperation to a kind of hollow resignation. You knew, he said to her, all these years, you knew exactly what I'd done, and you still took care of her. Why? Sister Grace looked at him with something that might have been pity, because that little girl needed someone to love her, and because I still believe, that people can change, that they can find redemption even after they've done terrible things. There's no redemption for what I've done, Henry said flatly. Florence is dead because of me. Hope lost her entire childhood because of me. Julian spent 24 years in hell because of me. Then make it right, Sienna said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. If you really want to atone for what you've done, then put down the gun and face the consequences. Let me go home to my father. Henry's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of the man he might have been if he hadn't let his obsession consume him. You forgive too easily, he said softly, just like Florence did. I'm not forgiving you, Sienna replied, her voice steady despite the gun still pointed in her direction. I'm just tired of letting your guilt control my life. I've spent 24 years wondering who I really was, and now I know I'm Hope Marie Walker, and I want to go home. The sound of her real name on her own lips seemed to affect Henry more than anything else that had been said. He lowered the gun slightly, his arm trembling with exhaustion. Hope, he whispered. Do you remember anything from before? I remember falling, she said honestly. I remember being scared, but I also remember feeling safe before that. I remember someone calling me Sunshine and singing to me at bedtime. I remember love. Henry, the love you tried to steal but couldn't quite destroy. Henry's face contorted with anguish. I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that. When you fell down those stairs, when I saw you lying there so still, I thought I'd killed you. I thought I'd murdered my own niece. But you didn't, Julian said quietly, his anger temporarily replaced by something that might have been compassion for his broken brother. She survived, Henry. She grew up strong and kind and beautiful. Despite everything you put her through, she became an incredible woman. Because of Sister Grace, Henry said, looking at the elderly nun with obvious respect. Not because of anything I did. No, Sister Grace said firmly. Because of who she was meant to be. Because of the love Florence and Julian gave her in those first 4 years of her life. That foundation was strong enough to survive anything. Even you. Outside, Sienna could hear more police vehicles arriving, their sirens wailing through the gathering dusk. The situation was escalating, and she realized that if Henry didn't surrender soon, this could end with someone getting killed. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows. A storm was coming, the kind of violent summer thunderstorm that Miami was famous for. The storm, Henry said suddenly, his voice distant. It's just like that night when Florence... He trailed off, but Sienna understood. The night Florence had driven her car into a tree, ending her life and leaving Julian to grieve alone. It had been stormy then, too. Henry, Julian said gently, give me the gun. Let's end this before anyone else gets hurt. But Henry was already shaking his head. You don't understand. If I surrender, If I go to trial, it all comes out. Everything. The media will destroy our family name. Valeria will have to live with the shame of having a father who's a kidnapper. The Walker Holdings empire that our grandfather built will be ruined. I don't care about any of that, Julian said firmly. I only care about getting my daughter back safely. And I care about not spending the rest of my life in prison, Henry replied, his grip on the gun tightening again. Which is exactly what will happen if I surrender, the lead police officer spoke into his radio, requesting backup and probably a hostage negotiator. But Sienna sensed that time was running out. Henry was becoming more agitated with each passing minute, and the combination of guilt, fear, and desperation was a volatile mix. There's another way, she said suddenly. Both brothers looked at her. What do you mean? Julian asked. I mean that maybe this doesn't have to destroy everyone, Sienna said carefully, trying to think through the implications even as she spoke. Henry, you said you've been supporting me financially all these years, right? Paying for my care, making sure I had what I needed. Henry nodded cautiously. Then maybe the kidnapping was the act of a young man who made a terrible mistake. But the 24 years since then have been the act of someone trying to make amends. Maybe that counts for something. Hope, no, Julian said sharply. You don't owe him anything. What he did was unforgivable, Sienna finished. But what's done is done. The question now is what happens next. Do we let his guilt destroy what's left of our family? Or do we find a way to move forward? Henry stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. You would do that after everything I've put you through. I'm not doing it for you, Sienna said honestly. I'm doing it for Valeria, who doesn't deserve to have her life ruined because of her father's crimes. I'm doing it for Julian, who's already lost 24 years and doesn't need to lose his brother too. And I'm doing it for myself, because I'm tired of letting the past control my future. The gun in Henry's hand was shaking so violently now that Sienna worried it might go off accidentally. Rain was beating against the windows with increasing intensity, and lightning flickered through the gathering darkness. I don't deserve your mercy, Henry whispered. No, Sienna agreed. You don't, but I'm offering it anyway. Henry looked at Julian, then at Sister Grace, then back at Sienna, for a long moment. The only sounds in the room were the storm outside, and the tense breathing of 7 people waiting to see how this nightmare would end. Finally, Henry began to lower the gun, and then, just as Sienna allowed herself to hope that they might all survive this intact, lightning struck somewhere nearby, plunging the house into darkness. In the sudden blackness, she heard the gun clatter to the floor, followed by the sound of footsteps running toward the back of the house. Henry Walker, consumed by 24 years of guilt, and unable to accept the forgiveness he'd never deserved, had chosen to run into the storm rather than face the consequences of his actions. The police found Henry Walker 3 hours later, huddled in a drainage culvert 2 miles from Sienna's house, soaked to the bone and shivering from more than just the cold rain. He surrendered without resistance, his 24 years of running finally over. But for Sienna, the real journey was just beginning. She sat in the emergency room at Miami General Hospital, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite the warm night, watching Julian pace the small waiting area like a caged animal. The police had insisted on bringing her in for a medical evaluation after the standoff, standard procedure for hostage situations, but all she really wanted was to go somewhere quiet and try to process the fact that her entire life had been rebuilt in the space of a few hours. Miss Carter, the doctor who approached, was young, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone used to dealing with trauma victims. I'm Dr. Reyes. How are you feeling? Like I woke up in someone else's life, Sienna said honestly. Dr. Reyes smiled sympathetically. That's more common than you might think. Sudden revelations about identity can be as traumatic as physical injuries. I'd like to run a few cognitive tests, just to make sure you're processing everything normally. As the doctor led her through a series of simple assessments, memory tests, coordination checks, questions about her emotional state, Julian remained in the hallway, visible through the glass door. Every few minutes, their eyes would meet, and Sienna would see the same mixture of wonder and disbelief in his expression that she felt in her own heart. This man was her father, not the faceless, nameless figure she'd imagined during her childhood at St. Grace, but a real person with laugh lines around his eyes and hands that shook when he thought she wasn't looking. A man who'd spent 24 years searching for her and had never given up hope. "Your vital signs are normal," Dr. Reyes said, finishing his examination. "Physically, you're fine. Emotionally, well, that's going to take time. I'd recommend seeing a counselor who specializes in family reunification. What you've been through, what you're all going through. It's unprecedented." When they finally released her, Julian was waiting in the corridor with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, and worry etched into every line of his face. "How do you feel?" he asked, standing as she approached. "Confused, scared, angry." Sienna paused, searching for the right words, but also relieved. "Like I've been carrying around this emptiness my whole life, and now I know why." Julian's eyes filled with tears. He was trying hard not to shed. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you need time to process everything. I don't want to push you, but you're my father," Sienna finished softly. "And you've been waiting 24 years to say that." "Yes." They stood in the sterile hospital corridor, two strangers who shared blood and 24 years of separation, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between who they'd been and who they might become. "I'd like to see the house," Sienna said suddenly. "The one I grew up in before everything changed." Julian's face lit up with something that might have been hope. "Of course, I mean, if you're sure it might be difficult." "Everything about this is going to be difficult," Sienna said. "But I need to see it. I need to understand who I was before Henry took me away." The drive to the Walker estate was surreal. Sienna found herself studying Julian's profile as he drove, looking for traces of herself in his features, the shape of his hands on the steering wheel, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, little gestures that felt familiar, even though she was certain she'd never noticed them before. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they turned through the iron gates she'd driven through as an employee just days earlier. "Anything. What was I like before, as a little girl?" Julian's smile was soft and painful at the same time. "Fearless. Absolutely fearless. You would have jumped off the roof if Florence and I hadn't watched you every second. You loved the water. You used to splash in the bathtub until you soaked the entire bathroom. And you talked constantly. Questions about everything. Stories about imaginary friends. Songs you made up. Songs. You inherited your mother's musical ability. Florence was always singing, and you picked it up almost before you could walk properly. Dreams of Sunshine was your favorite, but you made up dozens of others." They pulled into the circular driveway, and Sienna felt that same jolt of recognition she'd experienced on her first visit. But now it was stronger, less confusing. This wasn't déjà vu. This was coming home. Julian led her through the front door, moving slowly as if he were afraid she might bolt. The grand foyer looked different somehow. Less intimidating and more familiar, like a half-remembered dream becoming real. "Your room is upstairs," Julian said quietly. "I've kept it exactly the way it was. I know that might seem morbid, but I couldn't bear to change anything." Hope's bedroom was a shrine to a 4-year-old's imagination. Pink walls covered with handprints and crayon drawings. A tiny bed with a canopy of fairy lights. Shelves lined with books and stuffed animals, all waiting patiently for their owner's return. Sienna walked to the window and looked out at the garden where white roses bloomed in the moonlight. A flash of memory hit her. Not a dream this time, but a real recollection. Standing on a chair at this same window, watching Florence work in the garden below, feeling safe and loved and completely secure in her small world. "I remember this," she whispered, pressing her hand against the glass. "I remember watching her from here." Julian came to stand beside her, and she could feel the emotion radiating from him like heat. "She would have been so happy," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "So proud of the woman you became, strong and kind and brave, everything she dreamed you would be." "Tell me about her," Sienna said. "Tell me about my mother." And Julian did. For the next 2 hours, sitting in Hope's childhood bedroom surrounded by toys and memories, he painted a picture of Florence Walker, a woman who sang while she cooked, who turned every rainy day into an adventure, who loved her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of a lioness and the gentle patience of a saint. "She never gave up hope," Julian said. "Even at the end, when the grief was eating her alive, She would still set a place for you at dinner, still buy you birthday presents, and wrap them for when you came home. Where are they? Sienna asked. The presents. Julian led her to the walk-in closet, where an entire wall was lined with wrapped gifts, 24 years worth of birthday and Christmas presents, each one labeled with care. For Hope, with love from Mama and Daddy. Sienna traced her fingers over the wrapping paper, some of it faded with age, but all of it chosen with love. Her parents had never stopped believing she would come home. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, turning to face Julian. I don't know how to be your daughter. I've been Sienna Carter for so long. I'm not sure I remember how to be Hope Walker. Then don't be, Julian said simply. Be both. Be whoever you are now, with all the experiences that made you who you are. I don't want to erase Sienna Carter. She's an incredible woman. I just want to get to know her as my daughter. They were interrupted by a soft knock on the bedroom door. Maria, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Pardon, Mr. Walker, she said softly. She said, I heard. Is it really true? Is she really? Maria, Julian said gently. I'd like you to meet my daughter, Hope. This is Maria. She's been taking care of this house, and me, for 15 years. Maria approached slowly, studying Sienna's face with wonder. Dios mío, she whispered. You have your mama's eyes. And your papa's stubborn chin. Despite everything, Sienna found herself smiling. It's nice to meet you, Maria. Bienvenida a casa, mija, Maria said, pulling Sienna into a fierce hug. Welcome home. Later, as dawn broke over Coral Gables, Sienna sat in the garden among the white roses, Julian beside her on a wrought iron bench that had been Florence's favorite spot. The events of the past 24 hours felt like a lifetime, but also like the beginning of something new. What happens now? She asked. With Henry, I mean. Julian's expression grew somber. He'll face charges, kidnapping, falsifying documents, obstruction of justice, but given the circumstances, the accident. The years he spent supporting you. His lawyer thinks he might be able to plead down to a lighter sentence. And Valeria. She'll need therapy, a lot of it. Finding out your father kidnapped your cousin and let your aunt die from grief. That's not something you recover from quickly. Sienna nodded, thinking of the fragile teenager who'd been making such progress in the pool. I'd like to keep working with her, if she wants me to, if you think it would help. I think, Julian said carefully, that you have a gift for healing people. It's something you got from your mother. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun rise over the garden where Florence had once played with her little girl, where Hope Marie Walker had taken her first steps and picked her first flowers, and learned that the world was a place where she was deeply, unconditionally loved. I need to see Sister Grace, Sienna said eventually. I need to make sure she's okay, and I need to say goodbye to Sienna Carter, I think, at least to that part of her that was built on lies. Of course, whatever you need. And Julian. She turned to look at her father. The words still felt new and strange, but increasingly right. I know this is going to be complicated. I know we both have a lot of healing to do, but I'm glad you never stopped looking for me. Julian's smile was radiant despite his tears. I would have searched forever, little sunshine, forever and a day, as the morning light grew stronger and the white roses released their sweet fragrance into the warming air. Hope Marie Walker, who would always be a little bit Sienna Carter too, began to remember what it felt like to be home. 1 year later, the morning sun cast dancing reflections across the Olympic-sized pool at the Hope Marie Walker Aquatic Therapy Center, turning the water into liquid gold. Sienna. She'd decided to keep the name that had shaped her for 24 years, while legally reclaiming her identity as Hope Marie Walker, stood at the pool's edge watching 8-year-old Marcus take his first independent strokes. That's it, Marcus, she called out, her voice warm with encouragement. Feel how the water is supporting you. You're doing amazing. The little boy had been terrified of water 6 months ago, a victim of a near-drowning incident that had left him with panic attacks and nightmares. Now he was swimming across the pool with confidence, his face lit up with the pure joy that Sienna had learned to recognize as the moment when healing truly began. Miss Sienna, did you see me swim all the way across? Marcus reached the far end of the pool and turned back to her with a grin that made her heart swell with pride. "I saw every stroke," she laughed. "You've officially graduated from my beginner class. Next week, we'll start working on your butterfly stroke." As Marcus's mother helped him out of the pool, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes, Sienna felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned to find Julian approaching with 2 cups of coffee, and the smile that had become as natural to her as breathing over the past year. "Another success story?" he asked, handing her one of the cups. "The best kind," Sienna replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "He reminded me of myself when I first started working with Valeria, scared but determined." Julian's expression grew thoughtful at the mention of his niece. Valeria had indeed required extensive therapy after Henry's arrest and confession, but she'd surprised everyone with her resilience. The 16-year-old had not only continued her swimming lessons with Sienna, but had become one of the center's most dedicated volunteers, helping other traumatized children find their courage in the water. "Speaking of Valeria," Julian said, "she asked if she could invite some friends to your birthday party next week. Something about wanting to introduce them to her amazing cousin who's basically a mermaid." Sienna's 29th birthday would be the first she'd celebrate knowing her true identity. Surrounded by the family she'd thought was lost forever, the prospect both thrilled and terrified her. "As long as there's enough cake," she said, then paused. "Julian, can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Henry had if I'd grown up here with you in Florence? Do you think about the life we missed?" Julian set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. It was a question she'd asked in various forms over the past year. During the long months of therapy sessions and family counseling that had helped them navigate their complicated reunion. "Every day," he admitted, "but not in the way you might think. I don't mourn for the 4-year-old Hope who disappeared, because she grew up to become the incredible woman standing next to me right now. Everything you experienced, even the pain, made you who you are. And who you are is exactly who you were always meant to be, even if I never remember everything from before. Especially then, your memories of your early childhood may be fragmentary, but your heart remembered what mattered most. How to love fearlessly, how to help others heal, how to find light in dark places. That's pure Florence. That's pure you." They were interrupted by the sound of splashing from the shallow end, where Sienna's advanced class was warming up. These were her favorite students, teenagers and adults who'd experienced severe aquatic trauma, but had committed to the long journey of recovery. Among them was Elena Rodriguez, a young mother who'd nearly drowned saving her son from a riptide. David Kim, a college student who'd been in a boating accident that had killed his best friend Sarah Williams. A military veteran dealing with PTSD, who'd found that water therapy helped quiet the voices in her head. Each of them had found their way to the center through word of mouth, drawn by Sienna's reputation for achieving what seemed impossible, teaching people to trust the water again after it had betrayed them. "You know what I've realized?" Sienna said, watching her students support each other through their exercises. "Henry thought he was destroying our family when he took me away, but in some strange way, what he did led to this, led to me being able to help people the way Sister Grace helped me. Don't give him too much credit," Julian said with a slight edge to his voice. His anger toward his brother had softened over the year, especially since Henry had begun serving his 15-year sentence with what appeared to be genuine remorse. But forgiveness was still a work in progress. "I'm not giving him credit," Sienna clarified. "I'm giving credit to the people who chose to make something beautiful out of something broken. Sister Grace, who loved me when she didn't have to. You, who never stopped believing I'd come home. Florence, who loved me so deeply that I could feel it even when I couldn't remember her. And you," Julian added, "who chose to forgive instead of hate, to heal instead of hurt." The sound of a car pulling into the center's parking lot drew their attention. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Sienna could see a familiar blue sedan, the same car that had once belonged to St. Grace Children's Home. Maria Gonzalez, the center's administrative coordinator and Sister Grace's former assistant, was helping an elderly woman out of the passenger seat. The woman moved slowly, leaning heavily on a walker, but her eyes were bright and alert as she looked around at the beautiful facility that had been built in honor of her life's work. Sister Grace had been living in a specialized memory care facility for the past 6 months, her Alzheimer's having progressed to the point where she could no longer live independently. But she still had good days, and Maria had called that morning to say, this was one of them. She wanted to see the center, Maria explained as she helped Sister Grace navigate the entrance. She's been talking about her girl Sienna all week. Sister Grace's face lit up with recognition when she saw Sienna approaching. There's my sunshine, she said, her voice weak but warm. Look at you, all grown up and changing the world. Sister Grace, Sienna said, kneeling beside the wheelchair Maria had brought. I'm so glad you could come today. I wanted to see what you've built, Sister Grace said, her eyes taking in the spacious facility with its healing pools and therapy rooms. It's beautiful, dear. Florence would be so proud. The fact that Sister Grace could remember Florence's name but sometimes forgot Sienna's own was one of the cruel ironies of her disease. But on days like this, when her memory was clear and her spirit strong, she was still the woman who had saved a broken 4-year-old and taught her that love could overcome any trauma. Would you like to see the memorial garden? Sienna asked. I have something to show you. They made their way outside to a small courtyard where white roses bloomed in careful beds around a simple stone bench. Engraved on the bench were the words, "In memory of Florence Walker and Sister Mary Grace O'Sullivan, women who proved that love is the only force stronger than loss." Sister Grace read the inscription slowly, her fingers tracing the letters of her own name. You put me next to your mother, she said softly. You were both my mothers, Sienna said simply. Florence gave me life, and the first 4 years of love that carried me through everything that came after. You gave me a home and taught me that family is something you choose, not just something you're born into. And now I have both. I have the father who never stopped looking for me, and I have the memories of the woman who raised me. I have Julian's business sense and Florence's musical gift, and your stubborn refusal to give up on people. I'm all of it, Sister Grace. I'm everyone who loved me. As if to prove her point, the sound of children's laughter echoed from the pool area, where Valeria was leading a group of young swimmers through a water safety class. The teenager had inherited her family's natural leadership abilities, but she'd chosen to use them for healing rather than business. She's going to be fine, Sister Grace said, following Sienna's gaze. That girl has your heart. She'll use what happened to her to help others, just like you did. I hope so. I know so. Sister Grace reached up and touched Sienna's cheek with a trembling hand. You know what I've learned in all my years? Dear one, bad things happen to good people, and sometimes there's no reason for it. But good people have a choice. They can let the bad things make them bitter, or they can use them to become better. You chose better. You always choose better. Later that evening, as the sun set over Coral Gables, Sienna stood in Florence's rose garden holding the framed little sunshine towel that now hung in the center's main office. Julian stood beside her, and together they looked at the headstone that marked Florence's final resting place. I brought her something, Sienna said, pulling a small envelope from her pocket. It was one of the letters Julian had written to her over the years. The last one, written on her 28th birthday. She read it aloud, her voice carrying across the peaceful cemetery. My beautiful hope, you would be 28 today, old enough to have a family of your own, maybe children who would have been my grandchildren. I wonder if you remember us at all, if somewhere in your heart, you still carry the love your mother and I had for you. Florence died believing you were gone forever, but I can't let go. I won't let go. If there's even a chance you're out there, I'll keep searching until my last breath. Happy birthday, my little sunshine. All my love, Daddy. I'm home, Mama, Sienna whispered to the headstone. Your little sunshine came home, and she brought healing with her, just like you would have wanted. As they walked back toward the car, Julian's arm around her shoulders in the easy affection they'd built over months of learning to be father and daughter. Sienna hummed softly under her breath. It was Dreams of Sunshine, the lullaby that had carried her through 24 years of not knowing who she was, and that now carried her forward into a future bright with possibility. Behind them, the white roses released their sweet fragrance into the evening air, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, it was easy to imagine Florence Walker smiling as she watched her daughter, both daughters really, finally coming home. The water had taken so much from their family, but in the end, it had also given back the most precious gift of all, the chance to heal, to love, and to choose forgiveness over bitterness. Hope Marie Walker, who would always be a little bit Sienna Carter, had finally learned that sometimes the longest journey home is the one that leads back to yourself.